to this year's International Conference on the question of Palestine, on the question of Jerusalem, under the theme, Forced Demographic Change in Jerusalem, Grave Breaches and a Threat to Peace. This conference is organized by the United Nations Committee on the Exercise of Integral Rights of the Palestinian People, with the support from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC. I am Sheikh Nyan, a permanent representative of Senegal to the United Nations here in New York and chair of the committee. I will be moderating today's event. While the mission and the UN Secretariat here in New York are enjoying the gradual lifting of the COVID-19 restrictions and are looking forward to soon again have in-person events, we are holding today's conference on WebEx. It is also live streamed on United Nations Television, webtv.un.org. This year, the annual conference on the question of Palestine will highlight the ongoing Israeli policies and practices to change the demographics and status quo in occupied East Jerusalem, with a special focus on evictions of Palestinians from their homes and demolitions of Palestinian houses and other structures in the city. While exploring means of addressing such violations in order to advance a just and peaceful resolution of the question of Palestine based on international law and relevant UN resolution. For this discussion, it is my pleasure to welcome Mrs. Lara Friedman, President of the Foundation for the Middle East Peace, Washington, D.C., Mr. Michael Lynk, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, Mrs. Suma Qawasmi, Community Leader in Sheikh Jarrah, East Jerusalem, Mrs. Nivine Sandouka, Executive Director of Hokokna, Our Rights, East Jerusalem, and Mrs. Emily Schaeffer Omer-Man, Human Rights Attorney, Tel Aviv. I would also like to use this opportunity to give a warm welcome to the audience following us via different platforms. While the representative of member states will be able to ask their questions or make comments in the WebEx platform, the global audience is invited to do so via the committee's Facebook channel by sending an email to bpr-meeting@un.org or via WhatsApp at +1 646 421 0579. Everyone is also encouraged to tweet the committee hashtag rights for Palestine, for like the number. After the initial introductory remarks by myself on behalf of the committee and by the representatives of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the United Nations Secretariat, and the State of Palestine, I will give the floor to our panelists. After their briefings, we will field questions from the member states and the wider audience. On behalf of the committee, I would like to request the esteemed colleagues from the member states to make short statements and to pose questions. We also welcome written statements to be sent to the Division for Palestinian Rights, who will upload them to the page on today's event on the committee website. Please now allow me to say a few words about our committee. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, in 1975, the United Nations General Assembly established the Committee on the Exercise of the Integral Rights of the Palestinian People to pursue the following main goals. Firstly, promoting a just and peaceful settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and end to the Israeli occupation. Secondly, realizing the two-state solution, Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. And thirdly, supporting the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including self-determination, sovereignty, and right to return. We implement our mandate by raising awareness of the question of Palestine through a range of activities, among them events and conferences at UN headquarters here in New York and abroad, a capacity building program for the state of Palestine, and the annual observance of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people on the 29th of November. Since 2014, the committee has partnered with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to organize the annual International Conference on Jerusalem. We are holding this event, this annual event, one of the most important items in our program of work, to remind that the question of Jerusalem is the key aspect of the question of Palestine and a final status issue in the peace process, which can only be resolved on the basis of international law and the relevant UN resolution. This year, our virtual event is taking place amid serious developments on the ground and continued violent incidents in occupied East Jerusalem, particularly between Israeli security forces and settlers on the one side, and the Palestinian residents of the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in northern East Jerusalem on the other. These clashes, which started in the Islamic holy month of Ramadan, have continued ever since, and seen the use of rubber bullets and grenades against Palestinian residents, as well as the invasion of their homes and arbitrary arrests. As we meet today, 15 Palestinian households still face the imminent threat of eviction by the Israeli authorities from their homes. The Israeli High Court has scheduled a hearing soon to consider an appeal by some of the families. At the same time, another Palestinian neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem is under threat, that of Silwan, just south of the old city. There too, Jewish settlers are evicting Palestinian residents from their homes under the protection of the Israeli security forces and administration. Here too, cases are before the Israeli High Court. While this is going on, thousands of extremist Israeli activists hold marches through East Jerusalem, chanting hate slogans against Palestinians and stopping only at the gate to the Muslim quarter of the old city. And as we discuss the situation in East Jerusalem today, we should all be reminded that similar provocations and escalations have led to violent conflict in May, which so severely affected the Gaza Strip. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, the continued expansion of settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the increased intensity of settler-related violence on Palestinian civilians testify to the need for the international community to continue standing firm on the two-state solution as the only viable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, leading to a long overdue Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. The committee will continue to underscore that the Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the demolitions and seizures of Palestinian structures, the eviction threats, particularly in the neighborhoods of Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan in occupied East Jerusalem, all constitute flagrant violations of UN resolutions and international law. There are a major obstacle to the achievement of a two-state solution and of a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. I hope that our conference today, through the gatherings of testimonies and expertise, will help educate our audiences and shed light on the worsening conditions of Palestinian lives in East Jerusalem and the precarity of their legal status and homes as the Israeli occupation, under which they have been living for the past 5 decades, continues to resort to an unfair, unequal, and thus illegitimate set of domestic laws in order to justify its grave breaches of international law. I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I would now like to request the representatives of the United Nations Secretariat, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Mrs. Rosemary DiCarlo, to deliver her remarks. After your participation, Madam, in this year's United Nations Forum on the question of Palestine in May, we are honored once again to welcome you at an event of the committee. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to join you today for the International Conference on the Question of Jerusalem. I thank the United Nations Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, supported by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, for this timely initiative. The theme of this year's conference is particularly relevant, as the tragic events of this past May are still fresh in our memory. The surge in tensions and violence in occupied East Jerusalem since the beginning of Ramadan played a role in triggering the disastrous chain of events culminating in 11 days of deadly armed conflict. The Gaza escalation, the fourth since 2008, claimed many lives, including children, and left the Israeli and Palestinian populations deeply traumatized and even more distrustful of each other. The imminent threat of evictions of Palestinian families in occupied East Jerusalem from homes where they had been living for generations heightened tensions. Protests, violent attacks, the response by the Israeli security forces, and clash around the Al-Aqsa Mosque escalated them to a dangerous level. Inflammatory rhetoric from both sides further fueled conflict. I am especially concerned by the attempt to exploit the sensitive status of Jerusalem and to use it to justify a broader armed conflict. I echo the call by the Secretary General for Israel to cease house demolitions and evictions and illegal settlement activities in the occupied territory, in line with its obligations under international law. All measures to change Jerusalem's status and demographic composition are without legal validity and should be firmly rejected by the international community, in line with Security Council resolutions. Unilateral actions and provocations must cease. The Gaza ceasefire is holding, but remains fragile. The crisis is far from over. The launching from Gaza of incendiary balloons, causing fires in Israel, and the retaliatory Israeli airstrikes risk renewed escalation. The provocative flag march brought about more protests and violent clashes. The evictions, though put on hold for now, still threaten to heighten tensions. I reiterate the call to all sides to uphold and respect the status quo of Jerusalem holy sites. Political and religious leaders should promote mutual respect and tolerance through their actions and statements. This recent period of tension witnessed many civil society initiatives in which Palestinian and Israelis work together for calm. We should all amplify their voices against those spreading hate and inciting violence. The postponement of the Palestinian election process has also impacted the situation, with significant implications for the future of the Palestinian National Project. I echo the Secretary General in commending the tireless efforts of the Palestinian Central Elections Commission. Excellencies, the recent fighting caused heavy damage to vital infrastructure in Gaza, triggering a humanitarian emergency and exacerbating an already fragile situation. I appeal to the international community to respond generously to the Gaza humanitarian appeal and to work with the United Nations in delivering humanitarian, reconstruction, and recovery assistance. I join the appeals to Israel to facilitate the entry of humanitarian aid and reconstruction materials into Gaza. I also urge Hamas and other militant groups in Gaza to refrain from attacks and provocations that would again destabilize the situation. As the Special Coordinator told the Security Council, we must avoid short-term fixes and focus on how we can work toward resolving the deadlock in Gaza and the Palestinian divide. Sustaining ceasefires and improving arrangements on the ground are important elements of UN preventive diplomacy, which aims to create space for political action. But they cannot substitute a permanent status agreement, vital for sustainable peace. The recent crisis has served as another reminder of the imperative to renew momentum toward peace. The Quartet has stepped up its activities to bring about a new path to revive negotiations. The Secretary General has expressed hope that the normalization agreement signed between Israel and several Arab countries will create an opportunity for Israeli-Palestinian re-engagement. We will work tirelessly to translate these opportunities into tangible outcomes. I urge Israeli and Palestinian leaders, supported by a revitalized quartet, to recommit to a path of credible negotiations to address all the key outstanding permanent status issues. This is the only way to bring about the long-promised vision of the two states, based on 1967 borders with Jerusalem as their shared capital. In working toward this goal, it is essential to reestablish national unity and renew the legitimacy of Palestinian institutions. The United Nations is committed to supporting Israelis and Palestinians in these endeavors. Thank you for your attention.
I thank USG DiCarlo for her remarks. And on behalf of the committee, I would like to reiterate our appreciation and gratitude to her and through her to the Secretary General, Ms. Guterres, for the support given to the committee and the Division of Palestinian Rights, the UN Secretariat. I understand that USG DiCarlo will need to leave after the opening. I would like to thank her already now for her participation. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to the representative of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, our dear friend, Assistant Secretary General for Palestine and Al-Quds Affairs, Mr. Samir Bakr, to deliver his remarks. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your Excellency, Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, UN Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Your Excellency Ambassador Sheikh Nyang, Chair of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, Your Excellency Minister Riyad Mansour, Permanent Observer of the State of Palestine to the United Nations, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express our deep appreciation and gratitude to the United Nations and the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People and its Bureau for the regular cooperation and co-organization of the annual event in fulfillment of our shared commitment and responsibility towards advocating and mobilizing support and championing the cause of Palestine. This meeting takes place at a time overburdened by the gravity of increasing Israeli violation of international law and international humanitarian law, which continue to be perpetrated all over the occupied Palestinian territory with total impunity. We stress that all racist and colonial policies, which have been recently exacerbated by the escalation in acts of violence by Israel, the occupying power, and extremist settlers against the Palestinian people, repeated attacks against Al-Aqsa Mosque, the destruction of homes and properties, and forced eviction orders of Palestinian families from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan neighborhood in East Jerusalem will neither create right nor gain any legitimacy. These illegal acts by Israel, the occupying power, constitute a blatant violation of the political and legal rights of the Palestinian people and to the United Nations resolutions, particularly Resolution 2334 of 2016. The situation is further aggravated as a result of the recent devastating outcomes of the Israeli brutal airstrikes on Gaza Strip that claimed more than 250 lives, including 66 children and 39 women, and at least 1,900 injured, in addition to thousands of homeless people, huge infrastructure damage, homes and civil facilities destruction. The OIC affirms in this regard that the absence of effectively dissuasive international measures have only emboldened Israel, the occupying power, to carry on with its violations without punishment. In this regard, we call upon the international community to activate legal mechanisms that guarantee the accountability and liability of Israel, the occupying power, provide international protection for the Palestinian people, and take all necessary measures to exert pressure on Israel, the occupying power, to honor its obligations under international law and relevant United Nations resolutions. Ladies and gentlemen, while emphasizing the occupied city of Jerusalem is an integral part of the Palestinian territory occupied in 1967, whose annexation by Israel is illegal, null and void under international law and relevant United Nations resolutions, in particular United Nations Security Council Resolution 478. The OIC urges the international community to retract or refrain from any position or measure that contribute to legitimating the occupying powers' pernicious moves and maneuvers aimed at changing the demographic, political, legal, and historical status of the holy city of Jerusalem. We also invite the United Nations Security Council to ensure compliance with its resolutions and take necessary measures to halt Israel's violation of international law, colonial settlement, and ethnic cleansing policies, and avert dire repercussions that may plunge the already volatile region into a cycle of violence. We affirm on this occasion that the ultimate objective remains the revival of a credible and meaningful political path for achieving a just, comprehensive, and durable solution that leads to end the Israeli colonial occupation and establish the state of Palestine on pre-1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, in accordance with the United Nations resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative. In closing, while reaffirming the full support of the OIC for the Palestinian people in their endeavors to regain their legitimate and inalienable rights, I wish this meeting every success. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, dear ASG Samir Bak, for your statement. The committee appreciates the support of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in today's events, but also in our common endeavors. It is now my pleasure and my honor to ask my colleague and friend, Riyad Mansour, permanent observer of the State of Palestine to the United Nations in New York, to deliver his remarks. My friend, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want also to thank my brother Samir Bakr for being with us representing the OIC, and Madame Di Carlo representing the UNSG, and all of our esteemed and distinguished presenters. Allow me at the beginning to thank the committee, thank the OIC and the UN for collaborating to organize this 8th International Annual Conference on the Question of Jerusalem. It is very unfortunate that we could not have organized this meeting in person because of the COVID. Nevertheless, it is extremely important that this conference has been organized, particularly at this very critical moment, as the Palestinian people in occupied Jerusalem are going through, and the Palestinian people in general are going through, as a result, this massive aggression repeated every now and then by the Israeli occupying authorities against our people and against our holy sites. This aggression that started at the beginning of Ramadan in Al-Aqsa Mosque and Al-Haram al-Sharif, extended to the neighborhoods of Bab al-Amud, Sheikh Jarrah, and Silwan, in implementation of clear ethnic cleansing crimes against the Palestinian people, and in implementation of this apartheid manifestation system against the Palestinian people, not only in the occupied territory, but also inside Israel itself, against the Palestinian who are citizens of the state of Israel. Mr. Chairman, we convene at this moment to extend our support and to stand with the people of Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and the people in Jerusalem. If we are really faithful to international law and to Security Council Resolution 476 and 478 and 2334, it is not sufficient to reiterate these principles while we see the occupying power committing these crimes without taking practical steps in defense of international law and in defense of these resolutions to come to the side of the Palestinians. I know that just to ask from the Palestinian people to do so many things, we take note of that. But don't you think that if settlements to continue, in spite of all the resolutions, including 2334, and the international community, including the UN, does not do any practical step to stop these crimes from taking place, is needed? It is not only sufficient to ask the Palestinian people to do certain things. You have to ask yourself, what are you doing after 75 years of Nakba and 54 years of occupation in implementing your resolutions and defending international law in a practical way? It is not sufficient to say that Israel should restrain itself from killing civilians in attacking the Gaza Strip, and you do nothing about the crimes committed against that led to the killing of 66 children, 39 women, and many others in the Gaza Strip. This situation now requires action, steps, and if we cannot bring the occupying power to respect international law and its obligations and Security Council resolutions and UN resolutions in general, it is not fair to keep asking the Palestinian people to do certain things. There is tremendous amount of frustration and resentment among the Palestinian people to this abhorrent system of occupation, and they want to end it, and they want to end it now. Are you with us in the journey of doing practical things in order to bring this occupation to an end. Enough is enough. The Palestinian people cannot wait for a longer period of time to stop this occupation, to end it, and to defend our land, to defend our people in Beta who are peacefully resisting the occupation and the occupying authority from allowing an illegal settlement to be established in Jabal Abu Sbeh, the mountain of Sbeh. I think that this is a awakening moment for all of us not to allow Israel to be treated above international law. It is high time for the International Criminal Court to expedite and to move in an accelerated manner in continuing its investigation against these war crimes committed against the Palestinian people, whether in the form of the war crime of settlement activities or the war crime committed against our people during the war of 2014 and what happened after it. Let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, that we are honored to have all the distinguished panelists that we will listen to them, including those who are from Jerusalem, the two Palestinian presenters, which I welcome, and all others who are legend and big names in defending international law and UN resolutions. Our Palestinian people are determined to put an end to this occupation. They will not break, they will not bend down, and they will continue the struggle and the challenge for the international community, for all of you. Do more practical things to help the Palestinian people to accomplish their objectives and to implement their inalienable rights, self-determination, the independence of their state with East Jerusalem as its capital, and to the return of the refugees on the basis of international law and relevant UN resolution. And Mr. Chairman, thank you. We want to thank the committee for all the great things under your leadership that they are doing. And we want to thank the division for facilitating such conferences and for their noble work. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our people who are listening to us.
Minister Mansour, I thank you for your remarks, and I thank you for being a strong and passionate voice of your people. We understand and share the frustrations related to the stalemate, I would say even the worsening of the situation of the Palestinians in their own land. And on behalf of the committee, I can assure you of our continued support to achieve the exercise by your people of the inalienable rights. To use your word, I can assure you that we are with you in your journey to sovereignty, your journey to dignity and freedom, and your journey to the reign of international legality in your country. So thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I will now move to our panelists, and I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Mrs. Lara Friedman, the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace in Washington, D.C. Prior to that position, she was the Director of Policy and Government Relations at Americans for Peace Now. She was also U.S. Foreign Service Officer, serving in Jerusalem, Washington, Tunis, and Beirut. Mrs. Friedman is a leading authority on UN foreign policy in the Middle East, with a focus on the Arab-Israeli conflict settlement in Jerusalem and on the role of the U.S. Congress. Madam, we are pleased to have you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the committee for having me here today. It's an honor to address this forum, and it's truly an honor to speak alongside such an esteemed panel of fellow presenters, including presenters who are on the ground in Jerusalem. I'm looking forward to hearing them very much. The organizers have asked me to cover an enormous amount in these brief remarks, so by necessity, I'm going to be speaking in broad brushstrokes. And to begin, I think it's really important to emphasize what we're focusing on, why the world is focused on Jerusalem today, what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, isn't new. It's not sudden. It didn't come out of nowhere. People tend to start paying attention to Jerusalem when things blow up, when there's conflict on the ground that they notice. But the reality is that what we're seeing on the ground today has been happening in various forms every single day pretty much since 1967, when Israel took control of East Jerusalem. And what we're seeing today in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan are maybe the most brutal sort of elements of what are the realization of plans and efforts that have been in the works for years, have been ongoing. And these efforts are part and parcel of Israeli policies of what I call demographic engineering in Jerusalem that really started immediately after the 1967 war. And you know, as someone who's followed settlements at almost a micro level for years, I can tell you these policies have not been always the same. They've ebbed and flowed in intensity over the past 54 years, and their focuses have shifted with politics and with other circumstances, and thus the public awareness and international engagement regarding these efforts has risen and fallen accordingly. But make no mistake, what we're seeing happening today in Jerusalem is the logical and indeed, I would say, inevitable result of the Israeli government working hand in hand with ideologically motivated actors, both in Israel and actors from outside Israel, for more than 53 years to implement a systematic policy of demographic engineering. And they have done so, as Ambassador Mansour said, with total impunity, total lack of consequences. So actually what's happening today is really a result of that impunity. The organizers asked me to cover pre-48 to the present, so again, I'll be very telegraphic here. Looking at pre-67 Israel in Jerusalem, I think it's important to note that demographic engineering wasn't the same issue, because the War of Independence, the Nakba, took care of West Jerusalem, right? Palestinians left and they weren't allowed to return. And Israel, as a new state, took those properties. They treated them as abandoned properties or enemy properties, and Jewish Israelis settled in them. And that has been the status quo since then. And it's a status quo that is not challenged by the world. The world, when it engages on Jerusalem, engages on it as an East-West issue and engages on the 67 line. But it's really important to remember that for Palestinians, in living memory, Palestinians saw their homes lost in West Jerusalem, denied the right of return. Now, flipping, again, I'm being very telegraphic, to post-67, and this issue of right of return is important because what we're seeing today in Sheikh Jarrah and in Silwan is actually a piece of the right of return question. It's the question of who has a right to return, because the expulsion of families from Sheikh Jarrah hinges on Israel's assessment that legally, Jewish Israelis have a right to return to properties lost in the 48 war, while Palestinians have no right to return to anything that was lost in the 48 or 67 wars. So there's a lack of symmetry there, which is important. But starting at 67, and what Israelis and I think most Jewish supporters of Israel around the world see as the miracle of the return of the Jewish people to the Old City and the Temple Mount and the Wailing Wall, as part of a national narrative of God being on the side of Israel in the 67 war when it survived what is seen as the effort to erase it from the map, and seen as part of the inevitability and irreversibility of Israeli control over the entire city. And I think it's important to note that when we talk about demographic engineering in East Jerusalem, you saw this almost immediately with what is the world has almost entirely forgotten. When they look at the Western Wall Plaza, they forget that when in 67 Israel took over East Jerusalem, the Western Wall Plaza was actually called the Mughrabi Quarter. It was an inhabited quarter filled with Palestinians who were cleansed almost immediately, literally cleansed, just bulldozed out of there. Most of them ended up in the Shofat refugee camp in order to create what the world sees as an amazing place where tourists go, which is the Western Wall Plaza. But what's also different, if in 1948, Israel took possession of West Jerusalem and it was largely empty of Palestinians, in 67, Israel took over East Jerusalem and then very rapidly expanded it to include a much larger land area. But that area was full of Palestinians. which raised all sorts of concerns for Israel. The demographic balance nationally, you're trying to keep up the strong Jewish majority in the entire country, but particularly in Jerusalem. If you're going to say to the world that you have sole sovereignty, sole legitimacy in Jerusalem, defined as this giant united area, then it really matters to be able to say this is Jewish Jerusalem, the majority is Jewish, the majority of the population, and the control around it, right? So you saw very, very quickly after 67, the beginning of a whole psychology of demographic engineering, which has driven policy in Jerusalem ever since. And that starts with the people. It's not by accident that Israeli citizenship was not imposed on Palestinians who found themselves living under United Jerusalem after 67. Palestinians who found themselves inside Israel after 48 were not, given the offer of Palestinian citizenship. If you wanted to stay, or Israeli citizenship, if you wanted to stay, you became Israeli. It was imposed on you. And Jerusalem was not imposed on them. And some would argue, well, that's because Jerusalem was being held in limbo because there might be trading land for peace down the road. And I think that was something that maybe the status of Palestinians in Jerusalem potentially enabled that. But it also left those Palestinians in a legal limbo of resident status. And people need to understand that Palestinians born in East Jerusalem, Palestinians whose families have been there for generations under Israeli law, have the status essentially of foreigners who have been given the right to live there. And that is not a right. They've been given the privilege of living there. They don't enjoy the rights. And that privilege can be rescinded at any time. And that continues to today. So you've now got a Palestinian which lives in legal limbo and can be easily, or in theory, can easily be played with. In addition, immediately after 67, you saw various means used to seize huge swaths of land in East Jerusalem, take it as state land, enemy territory, take it for security reasons, declare national parks. And these lands almost immediately and then over the years became the land bank for building huge settlements. And these are government-backed settlements. And these settlements, again, speaking of demographic engineering, there's nothing accidental about Israeli settlements in East Jerusalem. If you look at the map, you have settlements that have been built to limit Palestinian growth and contiguity within Jerusalem, right? To break up where Palestinians live and to fill in the empty spaces. You have settlements that are built to anchor the entirety of East Jerusalem to Israel. What my colleague Denny Seidemann used to refer to as making Jerusalem like the DNA strands that can never be pulled apart. You have settlements that are clearly intended to sever Jerusalem from the West Bank hinterland, right? So you can say that East Jerusalem can never be part of a broader Palestinian polity. And then you have, in the Sharon era particularly, you had the beginning of this idea of a greater Jerusalem that expands like a clover leaf, north, east, and south. So you end up with a huge chunk of the West Bank essentially being treated as the Jerusalem adjacent greater Jerusalem and expanding Israeli sovereignty that way. And in addition, and this is where we are today, you see the targeting of Palestinian homes and neighborhoods, particularly those inside the Old City and in the areas around the Old City, what we call the Holy Basin or the visual basin of the Old City. And this is by a range of means, including the government working in tandem with private actors legally and in some cases illegally. This was since the 80s. There was a Klugman Commission in the 80s through today, where you have the use of absentee property law, which has been weaponized to take land from Palestinians, particularly in these hot areas of East Jerusalem. And in parallel, you have this Jewish right of return, which has been basically used in Hebron and in East Jerusalem. And then going back to the Palestinian population, you have the issue over the years of Palestinians having their IDs taken from them, their right to live in Jerusalem, which is based on having been out of the country too long, or if your child is born outside of Jerusalem, or if Israel decides that your center of life is no longer in Jerusalem. There's punitive canceling of IDs. There are housing limitations, which prevent Palestinians from building, which has the effect not only of preventing them from building, but there's only so many people you can fit in a house in Jerusalem. So the idea is that we'll push people out beyond Jerusalem's borders, at which point they lose their Jerusalem IDs because they've lost their center of life, and then more settlements. All of this, and again, going very, very briefly, has over 54 years sowed enormous anger, resentment, poverty, I think some hopelessness, but it has not actually succeeded in pushing Palestinians out of Jerusalem. If you look at the population numbers, Palestinians, and this goes to that sense of, steadfastness, Palestinians have not left. Jerusalem is their home. And what you're seeing today is almost the clashing of a set of Israeli policies that are reaching almost their logical conclusion, right? If it's fairly not noticed by the world when Israel declares a bunch of land that, you know, is not anybody living on, so it doesn't have, there's no giant immediate human rights element to it. No one noticed that. So over 54 years, you keep turning up the heat. So from land to home demolitions to actually throwing people out and moving Jewish Israelis into their homes. That's what we're seeing. It's this escalation. And all of that escalation takes place because of impunity. And I'm speaking here not just to the policies of the American government, but the international community. We have 54 years of the international community, for example, not recognizing Israel's sovereignty in Jerusalem. That's East or West Jerusalem. But for 54 years, basically acting as if, well, West Jerusalem is off the table, we recognize sovereignty there, it's fine, and East Jerusalem is the only issue, which was not the policy from 48 forward. That's how people have behaved. If you see the policy which says, well, we don't recognize Israel's sovereignty in East Jerusalem, but whatever Israel does, whether it builds settlements or demolishes homes, the most you're ever going to see from the international community are some empty rhetoric. It would actually be irrational to expect the Israeli government to behave any way other than what it has done. And what you're seeing today, when you see families in Sheikh Jarrah, and by the way, these are families who were refugees from 48, so they're going to be twice refugees. And when you have Israel saying, well, this is just a real estate dispute, the international community has a very difficult time contending with that after 54 years of effectively saying, listen, we don't like what you're doing, but we're not going to do anything about it. There will be no consequences at all. The place where I think, and I hate to keep coming back to impunity, but that really is what it comes down to. And as Ambassador Mansour said, at this point, you know, what is left? We had an American journalist ask someone in the White House recently, so where do the Palestinians go for justice? And it's a really good question. And this isn't to say that there are not grievances amongst Israelis, Palestinians, that many people have grievances that need to be addressed. If the idea is that Palestinians should go to the Israeli High Court of Justice and wait for justice there, then that is delusional. The Israeli High Court of Justice has proven over decades that it is not willing to rule on the actual principles that underlie Israeli policy. To the extent that Palestinians can get any relief from the Israeli High Court of Justice, it is on technicalities. It is when the Israeli court says, well, we're going to order that this house not be demolished because of this specific set of circumstances, not because collective punishment is illegal, immoral, and we shouldn't do it. And it is striking when people talk about the question of accountability, when people suggest that the Palestinians who, again, in Jerusalem are not citizens, there's no one accountable in the Israeli government, are somehow expected to go to the very government that is carrying out these policies against them and has been doing so for 54 years in a systematic way, with successive attorney generals in Israel seeing it as their job to craft legal arguments to allow Israel to do what it is doing and to justify it legally, that they should go to that same justice system for justice for their own grievances. Where I want to leave it here. I want to hear from the people from Jerusalem, because I think they're the ones who have the most to say here. I think that as the international community and the UN is considering this, it is absolutely vital to understand there is nothing new today, right? It's as if you have someone who's been suffering from a terrible disease for 53 years. Everyone knows they're sick, but you only pay attention when they break out in a really, really uncomfortable looking rash. And the issue really isn't that you're worried that they're suffering. The issue is that the rash is uncomfortable for you to see. That is not the way to deal with human rights. That is not the way to deal with international law. You have a fundamental conflict here between the rights of Palestinians, the obligations of Israel international law, and what is happening on the ground. And maybe this latest upsurge of interest based on this itchy rash that people don't want to look at is going to be what makes people pay attention. But if it's not, have no delusions. There are going to be more symptoms, and they're going to get worse, because we are coming now really to a head. Israel has built settlements across Jerusalem. It has taken property throughout the neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. It has enacted laws in the West Bank that allow Israel to literally suspend private property rights of Palestinians in order to allow settlers to get away with what is illegal even under Israeli law. To think that Israel will sort of be restrained, will find it in itself to stop this, that would be delusional. The only thing that I think will ever make a difference here is to start dealing with this issue in a way that ends the total impunity for demographic engineering policies that we have seen for the past 54 years. Thank you.
Unmute, Mr. Chairman. We cannot hear you. Unmute. Cannot hear you.
Sorry about that. And I thank Mrs. Friedman for her interesting remarks and for her insight. I would like now to give the floor to our next speaker, Mrs. Suma Qawasmi, a community organizer and activist from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, and a senior program manager at Kids for Peace International. Mrs. Qawasmi studied English literature and business at Birzeit University and completed a diploma in education in 2019. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for inviting me today to speak about my neighborhood with all of you. Much respect. I'm going to speak a little bit about my neighborhood and what's going on. So what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah today is the accumulation of years of colonialism and ethnic cleansing. Sheikh Jarrah is one of the chapters of a modern military occupation that started 73 years ago and is still ongoing. The neighborhood, I believe, has only exposed the ugly truth of apartheid and war crimes committed by Israel to us Palestinians living in Jerusalem and in the West Bank. The neighborhood has been home to 28 Palestinians family. We're speaking about 550 individuals living in the neighborhood now. This neighborhood has been a home for them since 1956, following an agreement with the Jordanian Ministry of Construction and Development, with the UN Refugee Agency, UNRWA, where the government of Jordan provided the land, and the UNRWA covered the cost of constructing homes for those 28 displaced families who were, thank you, Ms. Lara, who said it before, those families were forcibly uprooted from their own homes in historical Palestine back in 1948. So we really don't want to experience this Nakba again and to live it again. Following the illegal annexation of Jerusalem in 1967, the families of Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood have been subject to falsified claims of ownership of the land by colonial settlers institutions, as well as continuous attempts for forced displacement backed by discriminatory Israeli policies, practices, and courts. Unfortunately, our court, we don't have living this, let's say, experience with the courts. What's happening in Sheikh Jarrah today is not a mere land grab. It's a pure settler colonialism. It's an illegal occupation of the resources of the childhood and the dreams of the Palestinian people. Israel really wants a land without people, but we're here. We, the people of Sheikh Jarrah, Jerusalem, and even Palestine, have no other option than being here in our houses. This has been home to us for generations and generations. Speaking about Sheikh Jarrah, I'm a third generation living in it, my dad and my grandpa. So honestly, we will not let them occupy our mind and voices, and we will continue to raise the voices against this systematic injustice and perceived racism, against all the Judaization policies, including substance feed and ethnic cleansing. And that's what we decided to do. My people, my age, we decided to use the only way and powerful way that we have in our hands. We decided to use the social media, and that's when in March we used or we started the hashtag Save the Sheikh Jarrah hashtag. To be honest, when we started this grassroots movement, as I said, it's a grassroots movement. Our target is still the people themselves, because we believe now that we are in a place where people can put pressure on the government to help us. For the past 3 months, the residents of the neighborhood, together with activists and supporters, we've been peacefully demonstrating against the current status, and we're trying to prevent settlers from taking over our Palestinians' homes. Despite what we're facing, despite the brutal violence and the unjustified force used by Israeli occupation forces to stop us from speaking up, we are still here and we're going to speak. As I said, people my age, we're only individuals. We decided that we're going to help our parents and grandparents to keep their houses and us keep our homes and live in it. We're not speaking about buildings. As I said, we're speaking about memories and childhood. It's a full life. So we believe that the world cannot continue to turn a blind eye to the violation of our basic human rights and freedoms. As people living under occupation, history cannot be repeating itself. I'll say it again, we really don't want to experience the Nakba again, as most of the people living in the neighborhood, they don't have other places to go live. If you're going to say, there's the people, they have houses in the West Bank, people, they have other houses, we cannot go there and we want to leave, and that's not an option, because this will put us under threat living in the West Bank, so we will lose our residency in East Jerusalem, and that's the only thing we're fighting for, and we will stay here. So as I said, people my age, what we're doing is we're trying to spread awareness. We're showing the world and the people what the Israeli government and the Israeli occupation has been doing to us as Palestinians since years and years, since 1948. I believe because of the technology and the network and all of what's going on around us, we succeeded this time to deliver our story to as many people as possible. To be honest, I don't remember with how many groups and people I spoke with, but that's what we've been doing. To be 5 of us, we're working only from home, thank God. Our work and our directors, they understood everything and they're helping and supporting us. And that's what we've been doing since March, since the end of March. We're only speaking. Thank you so much for listening to me and for inviting me to speak about the neighborhood and deliver my message. Thank you.
I thank community organizer Suma Qawasmi for the briefing and for sharing her perspective. I can see that the briefing is really fact-based because it's based on the daily lives of real people under occupation and aggression. So once again, I thank you very much. Our third speaker in this panel is Mrs. Emily Schaeffer Omer-Man, a human rights lawyer based in Tel Aviv. Prior to founding a new law practice in 2018, which focuses on strategic litigation abroad against human rights violations committed under the Israeli occupation. She served as a senior counsel and acting director of the Michael Scott Law Office. She had also provided legal counsel to human rights defenders and leading human rights organizations, among them Breaking the Silence, Yesh Din, Peace Now, Who Profit, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, Al-Haq, and Human Rights Watch. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you to the Honorable Chair, Mr. Ambassador Nyang, Your Excellencies, and this Honorable Committee for inviting me to speak before you today. It's truly an honor to join you once again and to join my esteemed panelists on this crucial and timely topic of forced displacement of Palestinian residents from Jerusalem. My colleagues on the panel have aptly described both the history and political context and the daily lived experiences of Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah. As an Israeli attorney, I want to talk specifically about the legal context and the way in which Palestinian residents' claims of their right to stay in their homes are treated within the Israeli legal system, as well as perhaps some opportunities to oppose and resist Israeli policy and practice to change the demographics in Israel and the OPT, and especially in Jerusalem. Over the years, there have been more than 100 legal proceedings on Sheikh Jarrah alone. And those proceedings all began, of course, after the 1970 law passed, which granted Jews claiming ownership over property in East Jerusalem and having lost it in the 1948 war were to be awarded rights of ownership and possession from the Israeli general custodian of absentee property. The legal claims and circumstances that have surrounded these cases can sort of roughly be divided geographically into the plight of Eastern Sheikh Jarrah and that of Western Sheikh Jarrah, where in the Eastern side, since the 1980s, in an effort to keep Palestinians in their homes, an agreement was reached that created a protected tenancy rather than ownership rights and circumvented the question of whether settler committees who had brought claims of ownership, supposedly on behalf of prior Jewish owners, were in fact valid. The problem is that while this may have kept many Palestinians in their homes, it allowed their residency and their rights of possession to be subject to the will of these settler committees who have the interest, of course, to evict them, and have used all kinds of procedural claims and claims of violations of the terms of those protected tenancies. And there have been a host of evictions on these grounds ever since. The plight of the Western side of the neighborhood has been slightly different in the sense that there's been a years-long battle to prove the complicated status of the land with courts and various attorneys going over dozens and dozens of claims and documents with Palestinian residents claiming that the Jordanian authorities wrongfully granted title to Jewish tenants where the status of the land prior to 1948 and under the Ottoman period had been that of a public endowment that could not be owned, whereas the settler organizations claimed that the ownership and title granted by the Jordanian authorities was in fact valid. And that is what was ultimately accepted. In 2010, the Israeli Supreme Court finally rejected the Western neighborhood residents' claims of having had a long-term, of the prior Jewish owners having had a long-term lease, and then again used procedural grounds to reject the claims of the Palestinian residents, including that of an expired statute of limitations. In other words, that the incredibly complex details of property and title and possession and long-term lease, et cetera, having not been raised or even understood to the extent that they could be raised and challenged at the time, was then used against the Palestinian residents in their attempts to gain their rights back and avoid displacement. This is a lot of particulars. The problem is that when I give you all of these details, I'm actually sort of stepping into the Israeli legal framework, because the Israeli legal framework, as my colleague Lara Friedman mentioned, is that this is essentially boils down to a real estate dispute, right? Who had what title, what type of lease, what type of tenancy, what are the rules of that tenancy? And no matter what the particulars have been in these more than 100 cases, across various instances of the Israeli courts, the legal discussion has been completely devoid of the context. The words refugee, even occupied territory, have never been used. A discussion about the disparity between allowing Jews to claim ownership of homes that they may have lived in pre-1948, while barring that through the absentee property law of 1950 to the Palestinian residents, most of whom were themselves refugees, right, placed in Sheikh Jarrah, is never discussed in any of these cases. It's hardly discussed in the media. And of course, international law is absent from the analysis, right? So the occupation, the legal framework of IHL, of international humanitarian law, not discussed. It is simply boiled down as if it is a question on equal footing between two disputing parties about who has claims to a particular piece of property. And the truth is, and I think this has been said, this isn't new. It isn't an isolated situation. It's not even unique. Of course, not to Sheikh Jarrah. A similar model is assisting in the displacement of Palestinians in Silwan, but it is also rampant across the occupied Palestinian territory, whereby there is a lack of acknowledgement of broader context. There's a lack, of course, of recognition of certain policies and practices that blatantly violate international law, such as the settlement policy, but also the policy of displacing large portions of the Palestinian population who are themselves, again, protected persons living under occupation, whether that's in Jerusalem or the West Bank. And of course, we see this across Jerusalem, where we see, and across the West Bank, where we see so many homes under threat of demolition for supposed administrative reasons that are not only fulfilling a clear demographic policy that isn't hidden and isn't a secret, but also that departs starkly from international law and the parameters of IHL. When I last spoke before this committee 2 years ago on the topic of annexation, I described a phenomenon that I think is salient in this context as well, and unfortunately has not changed since. And that is an even larger trend to kind of rewrite international law out of the Israeli legal framework. Whether that means blurring the lines between settler and Palestinian, such that the term protected person no longer exists, but now we only refer to those who live in the occupied territory as the local population, and thus changes to the territory, changes to land and property, allocation of land can be justified because it's for the benefit of the local population, a twist of those words, or whether it's attempts by the government to weaken the Supreme Court and other institutions that are sort of the last bastion of any kind of consideration of the international law context, or to move property disputes, particularly in the West Bank, into local Jerusalem courts as if they are local property disputes, therefore creating, again, this kind of creeping legal annexation. And so these are the trends. The question, of course, then remains, and I've been asked to kind of weigh in on whether there are opportunities, therefore, to resist and oppose these policies through the Israeli legal system. The specific questions on Sheikh Jarrah, I think that there are some potential ways to kind of try to move mountains that might even take a miracle. So were the courts to be open, for instance, to revisiting how they came to certain decisions about ownership, we might be in a different position. But with the current situation being as it is, there are other reasons to use the Israeli courts to bring cases like these. One of them, of course, has always been to buy time, to use stall tactics in order to keep people in their homes while other strategies are being pursued. Another, of course, is to exhaust remedies locally in order to then think about international and foreign opportunities, legal opportunities and otherwise. And another that we often forget about is the opportunity not only to create kind of a platform for media, for awareness, for raising the issue into the public discourse, but also the amount of information, the access to information and the things that we learn about how these tactics are being implemented, about how policies are shaped and then carried out, is a true advantage in considering other kinds of tactics. But what this does mean is that cases that are brought to the Israeli courts need to be chosen very carefully and deliberately, because there is always a risk that that a judgment in an Israeli court could actually set back not only an individual case, but also the larger cause or goal. And so in these cases, I would argue that this is exactly where the importance of international law, the international community, and international legal systems come into focus and are really the primary source of potential redress and resolution for the situation that we're discussing today and its larger context: occupation, separation, inequality. And so I turn to third state responsibilities, not only of non-recognition, as well as positive action, such as substantive differentiation between settlements and Israel. But I believe also that the international community needs to support the International Criminal Court in its ongoing investigation to help counter efforts to delegitimize this important arbiter of international criminal law. And I also believe that it is the responsibility of states to ensure that their own corporations, private actors, are not also complicit in a lot of these policies and practices. Corporations are involved at every level of assisting the Israeli government, and in some cases are directly carrying out these policies and practices in violation of international law. Even in Sheikh Jarrah, there are ties to foreign corporations and private economic actors that are acting with impunity. And third states need to ensure regulation over their corporations so that they can be sure that they are not contributing to human rights abuses around the world, and in this case, even potentially war crimes and crimes against humanity. This means ensuring proper oversight and accountability to standards comporting with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And it also means ensuring that their domestic legal systems contain appropriate legislation and that judges and prosecutors are adequately equipped with the skills and the political will to try corporate offenders and hold them accountable for their extraterritorial violations. I want to thank you again for welcoming me to the committee again today, and I'll be happy to hear the rest of my colleagues and answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
I would like to thank Mrs. Schaeffer Omer-Man for her remarks. I would like also to thank her for her courage, positive engagement, and for so generously providing services and supporting the victims of human rights violations. I now welcome Mrs. Nivine Sandouka, Executive Director of the newly established NGO focus on our rights in Jerusalem, focusing on civic and political rights of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, especially women. She also currently works with the German Association for Development Cooperation. She's a board member in the Jerusalem Center for Women and the Alliance for Middle East Peace, ALMEP, and represent civil society in the International Reference Group for the World Council of Churches. Mrs. Sandouka, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairperson, esteemed representatives, Minister Mansour, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present to you today the reality in East Jerusalem, especially regarding civil society and non-state actors. To begin with, I would just like to emphasize what my esteemed colleagues already pointed out. One of them is, and I'm talking about the previous government of Israel, because until now, we don't really know what are the new measures of the new Israeli government would be regarding East Jerusalem. So the previous government of Israel was working firstly to emphasize the Jewish elements in Israel's identity. And that can be very obvious in Jerusalem itself. If you look at the school curriculums, trying to maintain control the curriculum which is taught in schools, trying to eliminate any mention of the Palestinian identity, of the narrative of the Palestinian people, and all the time trying to enter into the educational system by taking away that Palestinian identity. Second, it pushed ahead, as mentioned earlier, with settlement expansion and building in East Jerusalem. According to data obtained in 2019, there has been a 60% increase in settlement expansion in East Jerusalem. Almost, if we put it like in figures, almost 22,000 building permits issued to Jewish residents in East Jerusalem, and only 9,500 to Palestinians in East Jerusalem. Knowing that East Jerusalem is made up of 60% of the Palestinians, and they only received 30% of building permits, putting it all into perspective. On top of that, if you look at the planning vision of Jerusalem, there was no planning for the expansion of Palestinian neighborhoods. So whatever existed prior to 67, it is the same neighborhoods. We don't see any kind of natural expansion or planning to expand or build any Palestinian neighborhoods in the city. Therefore, and also with what Ms. Friedman pointed out, that we are residents and not citizens, which means that if we live outside of our city for a period of time, or if we get married to a person with a Palestinian citizenship, or we live, or if we travel for a certain period of time, our residency will be provoked, and we will never be able to live again in Jerusalem, knowing that we pay equal, if not the same, if not more taxes in East Jerusalem with no representation whatsoever. Still, we decide to live in these circumstances, which means that the places we live in are densely populated with lots of problems, social problems, and according to Israeli statistics, actually, it showed that the number of Palestinians living in poverty is 70% in Jerusalem, which is the highest amongst Israeli cities and Palestinian cities as well. Now, third is the steadily shrinking space for civil society. And I guess this is what is also important to what I'm talking about here. So the shrinking space is specifically related to civil society actors. And it really affects mostly the Palestinian civil society actors in the city. One of those regulations was issued in 2016, where civil society actors need to provide reports of their sources of funding. And if the sources of funding were from places that are not friendly to Israel, then this NGO might be closed down and the people behind it might be taken to court. And Emily, I'm sure you can also elaborate on that further as a lawyer as well. But anyway, so any of those Palestinian organizations or non-state actors in the city, if they express critical positions on Israel policies, human rights violations, or encourage any sort of Palestinian activism in the city, non-violent activism or political representation, actually, they are going to have to be affected by the repressive legislation and intimidation campaigns. And we always witness the NGO Monitor as a very good example of how good they can intimidate Palestinian NGOs as well as international actors as well. If anybody criticizes the occupation, they are immediately, monitored in the NGO Monitor, and they might actually jeopardize their source of funding, and thus they are unable to do any kind of work. So what can we actually do, and given these circumstances that the Palestinian civil society or non-state actors do? Now, I also want to mention before I dig deeper into this, is that in East Jerusalem, there are multiple players of non-state actors. One of them being purely Palestinian, and then we have Israeli non-state actors, and we have the shared Palestinian and Israeli non-state actors. For the Palestinians, obviously, they face the most hardships. So not only are they obligated to report their sources of funding, but also they are controlled in a sense of what they are able to do or not to do. So they cannot organize large events for large groups of people, especially if we're talking about political events or political activism. Then they are not able to do so. Recently, I was told that a director of a non-state actor in East Jerusalem was detained because they organized an activity for East Jerusalemites youth. Now, so what can actually do? So more and more of these non-state actors are focusing on the cultural activities. In terms of planning, urban planning, in terms of urban planning, actually, we have such organizations like, for example, the International Peace and Cooperation Center. So they carry out activities related to urban planning and zoning. The question is, do they actually talk to the Jerusalem municipality or not, since they have the plans already done? And does the Jerusalem municipality and relevant occupation authorities take that into account or not? That's a different question that I highly doubt that they take it into account. The other thing that we have some non-state actors that also support, especially in the residency issues, they support Palestinians, given the fact that they don't, first of all, Palestinians don't know Hebrew in East Jerusalem. Most of them don't know Hebrew, and thus they don't even know their rights in the city. So such organizations like Saint Eve, for example, they try to maintain the Jerusalem residency status and unifying families, like especially Palestinian citizenship and Jerusalem residency status. So they have a court, they have lawyers, and they can actually support the Palestinians. But yet again, this is a much needed service, and it is done too little. And it's like there's very few people or non-state actors that actually do that. In the case of Israeli civil society or non-state actors, we saw a couple of things. So first of all, we have organizations like B'Tselem and Iramim. B'Tselem and Iramim are one of those organizations who can do advocacy. They can create amazing reports, maps, because one, they know the language, they have the accessibility to the government as well, and they are Israeli, which gives them a little bit more flexibility in a sense of doing the advocacy work without putting themselves at risk. If we look at Sheikh Jarrah and what the non-state actors did over there, if we consider the activists like Suma herself as a non-state actor and all the younger people over there, it's amazing how they were able to utilize social media and grassroots activism based on rights. I'm sure they were inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. It was a very peaceful movement. It was using, as mentioned by Suma, social media techniques, non-violent, And at the same time, we also saw Israeli non-state actors actually joining some of those activities, in a sense trying to provide protective presence. But unfortunately, even that protective presence didn't really work, because according to different media reports, the Palestinian activism was 100% non-violent, which was met by 110% police violence in those cases. And it was all documented by activists such as Suma in Sheikh Jarrah, of how just standing in front of your house can get you shot at certain moments. So the question is, what can international community do? And of course, here I'm just, scratching the surface, given that we don't have enough time. So what can the international community do? From one hand, I can say protection of civilians. So far, unfortunately, as a person who's worked in civil society, we didn't see the United Nations taking this role of providing the Palestinians specifically with protection. And it is under the mandate of the United Nations to offer protection of civilians as a cornerstone for any peace process, both Israelis and Palestinians. And unfortunately, the UN has not taken this role yet. The other thing is about funding and opportunities for advocacy. We see lots of Palestinians, especially non-state actors, that are struggling to get a source of funding because of the law that exists, but because also maybe they are unable to access sources of funding. So really increasing the funding for them and giving them the opportunity to do advocacy work and to speak up and to have their voices heard is really important. Another thing which I think my colleagues, esteemed colleagues, already brought up is to hold Israel accountable for the living conditions for the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. What do I mean by the living conditions? I'm talking about the 70% poverty rate. I'm talking about the housing unit and the people being densely populated, especially in areas behind the separation wall. We're talking about the residency status, which again is in itself a human rights issue, because we're unable to practice many of our rights because we are residents and not citizens. And finally, the urban planning issue as well. Where do I expand? I live in Jerusalem. I have a son. I don't know where he's going to live in 10 years. Houses are being filled up. I don't want him to lose his residency either. So tell me, how do you hold Israel accountable for our own natural expansion? And finally, is to support the formation of an East Jerusalem elected representation in a democratic process. As Palestinians, unfortunately, we were unable to hold the elections in May, but still, Palestinians in East Jerusalem deserve to have a representation. And if the UN supports us in having such a process to elect people who can actually speak up of what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and elsewhere as well. And finally, and this is my final comment, is to support peace activists, because usually people look at us as normalizers, people who don't really talk of occupation, although the peace activists are the only ones that talk of occupation, especially women under United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 and its implication on women specifically in East Jerusalem. And again, thank you so much for this opportunity, and thanks for listening.
Mrs. Sandouka, we thank you for your remarks. Our gratitude to you and to your NGO for the excellent work you are doing to promote civic and political rights in East Jerusalem, such difficult circumstances. Thank you. Our last speaker in today's panel is our esteemed friend, Mr. Michael Lynk, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. Mr. Lynk is a frequent guest of our committee. He's also an associate professor of law at Western University in London, Ontario. Prior to becoming an academic, he practiced labor law and refugee law for a decade in Ottawa in Toronto. He also worked for the United Nations Human Rights and Refugee Issues in Jerusalem. We are pleased to have you again, Mr. Lynk. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask if I have a short PowerPoint presentation, if the PowerPoints could be uploaded for the screen.
Should be there.
Do people see them? I don't.
Not showing yet.
Let me try. Oops. Well, that's not going to work. Ilya, do you want to try once again? My apologies. I'm going to do, if they can't be shown, I'm going to speak anyways. What I was going to show you initially was actually a map of East Jerusalem. And this map, where 350,000 Palestinians along with 225,000 Israeli settlers live, would include a number of Israeli settlements within the boundaries of East Jerusalem, and as well as a number of Israeli settlements outside the formal boundaries of East Jerusalem, but which act as Jewish suburbs of the city. There would be a separation wall that snakes around the city. And what is interesting is that the separation wall does not follow the expanded boundaries of East Jerusalem. The separation wall, in fact, includes not only the Jewish settlements in East Jerusalem, but a number of Jewish settlements that are outside the formal boundaries of East Jerusalem. And one could wind up concluding from looking at such a map that three things. First of all, that these Jewish Israeli settlements encircle Palestinian East Jerusalem, and it physically blocks off the Palestinian West Bank like a fortress, and this is not an accident. The second thing you would see is that the separation wall weaves in such a way as to maximize the Israeli settlements and the Israeli settlers who live within it, while minimizing the number of Palestinians living within it. In fact, the wall includes a number of these Jewish suburbs outside of East Jerusalem, while excluding about 140,000 Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem. And as well, it would show that the two Palestinian neighborhoods that are the subject of most of the world's attention over the last 2 months, Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, are immediately adjacent to the old city, Silwan being to the immediate east of the old city, and Sheikh Jarrah to the north. Now, the one thing you wouldn't see from the map is that the Jewish settlers in East Jerusalem are all citizens of Israel, with all the rights that that implies, while almost all of the Palestinian residents have only a permanent resident status. They can't vote, and they have no voice in what is happening in East Jerusalem, and their standard of living is considerably below those of Jewish Jerusalemites, and because it is so difficult for Palestinians living in East Jerusalem to be able to get housing permits to build or expand on their homes and properties, their neighborhoods are twice as dense as the Jewish neighborhoods. And I think you can conclude from this that the purposes of the settlements is to demographically transform East Jerusalem to make it diplomatically and politically impossible for Israel to return East Jerusalem to the Palestinians as the national capital in their own state. What I also would have included in the PowerPoint is how international law winds up applying to the current crisis in East Jerusalem. The Security Council and the General Assembly has stated on a number of occasions that East Jerusalem is occupied, that Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem is both illegal and null and void, and that Israel's efforts to try to demographically change East Jerusalem through its settlements is prohibited and violates international law, and specifically the Fourth Geneva Convention. The Fourth Geneva Convention says that it's forbidden to confiscate private property of protected population under occupation, except for urgent military necessity. And there are two laws that are here that would have been alluded to by other of the panelists. In 1950, the Israeli Knesset passed the absentee property law, which said that Palestinians who were expelled or who fled their homes and properties and communities in the 1948 war cannot recover their property. In fact, that property goes to the ownership of the Israeli state through the custodian of absentee property. But there's a second law passed in 1970, also by the Israeli Knesset, called the Legal and Administrative Matters Law, and which says that Israeli Jews who lost their property in the 1948 war can reclaim their property. So what you have is approximately 30,000 or 35,000 Palestinians who fled their homes and property in West Jerusalem in 1948, not under Israeli law, reclaim their property, while the 3,000 or so Israeli Jews who lost their homes and properties in East Jerusalem following the same war are entitled to be able to claim their property. Now, if you look at what's happening, and I won't go into much detail because my panelists have done a great job on talking about Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, but we know that the current tensions, which ultimately led to the violence in Gaza in May, arose in part because of the incessant and intensive claims by Israeli settler groups to try to claim or reclaim properties in East Jerusalem, in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, which means that roughly hundreds of Palestinians are facing the imminent loss of their homes that they've been in since the 1950s. Many more, of course, will have insecure status because of the possible claims by Israeli settler groups in the foreseeable future. And as has been mentioned, Israeli courts do not recognize or apply international law. So the solemn protections offered to a population under occupation, including the Fourth Geneva Convention, are not recognized by the Israeli courts. And therefore, the Israeli courts have almost consistently sided with the settler organizations in these attempts to confiscate the property. And they've applied the 1970 law in order to be able to validate. Now, in many cases, it's not the original Jewish families who had properties prior to 1948 in East Jerusalem who are seeking to reclaim this. In many cases, it's these right-wing Israeli settler organizations who have claimed or sought to be able to be the heirs of these properties that are actually initiating the legal cases and claiming these particular property rights. What I wanted to be able to conclude on was something that Ambassador Mansour had briefly alluded to in his presentation. 41 years ago yesterday, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 476 on the 30th of June, 1980. And the resolution was aiming at the impending annexation legislation that was at that time being debated by the Israeli Knesset, and it would pass the following month in July of 1980. In its resolution, the UN Security Council says four important things. It said, and this is, you remember, is the occupation was only 13 years old at the time. It said that the occupation was already prolonged. These are its exact words, and that there is an overwhelming necessity to want to end it. Secondly, it condemned Israel's ongoing defiance of UN resolutions, particularly UN Security Council resolutions. Thirdly, it said that any proposed annexation and any demographic transformation of East Jerusalem is illegal and null and void. And fourthly, the resolution threatens accountability. It actually uses the term practical means and ways if Israel does not obey. So what can we take from this resolution 41 years later? First of all, if the occupation at that time, 13 years old, was already prolonged, and there already was an urgent necessity to bring it to an end in 1980, what are we to say in 2021? And I think we have to say this occupation has become indistinguishable from annexation, and also it's acquiring apartheid-like features. And I note, by the way, as something I would commend to everybody, 2 days ago, on the 29th of June, former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times, which he uses extraordinary language to be able to assess the situation. He says that the incremental de facto annexation has come to a point where the prospect of a two-state solution has all but vanished. He notes the fundamental asymmetry in power between the two parties. He says that Israel's intent is to maintain its structural domination and oppression of the Palestinian people through indefinite occupation, and done primarily through having a dual legal system in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. And he says this, he says the lack of any international legal accountability has enabled Israel to ignore successive UN resolutions, most recently Resolution 2334. And he says at the end of the day, what we have to do is think of a new framework where the pursuit of equal rights for all of those living between the Jordan and the Mediterranean is pursued. Now, if I can go back to the resolution 476 in 1980, I think in a nutshell that what happened in the summer of 1980 encapsulates all that has followed. The United Nations would anchor its supervision of the Israeli occupation firmly within the framework of international law and human rights. Secondly, in response, Israel would continue to defy the direction of the Security Council and continue its largely solitary and untenable stance that international law does not apply to the occupation. Thirdly, the various peace initiatives that began a decade later with the Madrid-Oslo process would rely upon realpolitik as opposed to international law to frame the negotiations. And fourth and finally, accountability measures, whenever they have been raised by the international community, would never be acted upon, signaling to Israel that there would be no costs for its truculence. So I ask the question, why has the world created such a rich body of laws and prohibitions regarding the Israeli occupation, and yet it has been so remarkably reluctant to want to enforce them? Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Lynk for his briefing. I would say that even without the PowerPoint, his presentation was clear enough and edifying enough. I would like to thank him for the views, the description of the situation of the human rights in the Palestinian occupied territory. We also thank him for value and appreciate his expertise and also the passion he has in pursuing the important mission entrusted to him. I now open the floor for questions to all our panelists and comments also from member states. members who express the wish to ask questions. And I will turn to the speakers for the answer. But first, I will give the floor to member states, and then I will go to the wider audience. And at this point, I think I have Indonesia who has requested the floor. Indonesia, you have the floor. Ambassador Mohammed Koba.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the outset, I would like to convey my appreciation to you for convening this meeting that addressed the topic of forced democratic change in Jerusalem, which reflects the emerging realities in the occupied Palestinian territory. In the recent days, we have witnessed how Israel, the occupying power, continues its illegal actions. Such illegal action constitute a grave breach of international law and a threat to peace. It will make a prospect for peace remain elusive. Indonesia feels that it is crucial to address the core of the problem, namely the Israeli occupation. Israel has continued its regime of racial oppression, domination, and dispossession over the Palestinian people. The latest violence only shows how critical the situation is, and the action by international community is a must. Just last week, during the extraordinary meeting of NAM Committee on Palestine, our foreign minister urged international community to take immediate and concrete actions. We cannot afford to wait for another violence, nor can we be complacent and continue managing the crisis. Instead, we need to push for more durable solution. In this regard, allow me to reiterate 3 points. First, durable solution to the issue can only be reached through credible multilateral negotiations. It is thus crucial to revive the process of peace talks based on two-state solution and in line with internationally agreed parameters. Second, there should be no impunity for human rights violations. The occupying power has continued its aggression and violations of human rights and humanitarian laws, as well as acted in contravention of various UN resolutions, and so far without any consequences. We must end this impunity. Indonesia welcomes the decision of the Human Rights Council to establish an independent international commission of inquiry to investigate violation and abuses of international law in the occupied Palestinian territory. It is important first step towards holding Israel accountable for its ongoing violation of international law. Third, we must prevent future recurrence of the atrocities. At the GA meeting last May, we called for the establishment of international presence in Al-Quds to monitor and ensure the safety of the Palestinian people in the occupied territories and to protect the status of Al-Haram Al-Sharif compound. We must continue to pursue this initiative and other initiatives aimed at preventing and putting an end to Israel's oppression and occupation of Palestine. And lastly, Mr. Chair, Indonesia will remain steadfast in its commitment to the people and the state of Palestine. We stand ready to support the Palestinian people and all the efforts to achieve a just, comprehensive, and lasting solution. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank Ambassador Koba of Indonesia for this statement. I now give the floor to Egypt.
Sorry, Excellency, I did not hear you. Did you say Egypt?
Egypt, yes.
Thank you, Excellency. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the presenters for their valuable insights, and a special thank you to His Excellency Ambassador of Palestine for his steadfast updates and his very critical role in pushing this matter through. This committee exercises a very critical role that needs to be upkept and maintained despite all the adversities and the challenges that we are all facing. Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank you for organizing this meeting and your efforts to support the rights of our brotherly Palestinian people. We firmly believe that continued unilateral measures carried out by Israel only escalates the situation on the ground. Such measures including confiscation of lands, demolition of Palestinian buildings and homes, settlement activities in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, administrative detention and attacks by Jewish settlers against the Palestinian people, in fact, too many to recount in such a short time. Such measures will only jeopardize the two-state solution and any prospects for a genuine peace. Egypt calls on Israel to uphold its commitments according to international law as an occupying power and offers protection to the Palestinian people from the violence of the extremist Jewish groups and respect the rights of the Palestinian people to freedom of worship and access to Al-Haram al-Sharif, in addition to respecting the legal and historic status quo in Jerusalem. The recent escalation of violence represents clear evidence of the need for reinvigorating the peace process and the implementation of a just, comprehensive, and permanent settlement of the Palestinian question according to international law, UN resolutions, especially 2334 and the Arab Peace Initiative and the two-state solution. We reiterate our support to the Palestinian people in fulfilling their legitimate aspirations towards self-determination and establishing their own independent state on pre-1967 lines with East Jerusalem as its capital. We continue to stand firmly with our Palestinian brothers in this. We commend the Secretary General's commitment to achieve peace according to agreed upon parameters and international law, and to achieve self-determination and combat any discrimination against the Palestinian people. The UN's role remains very important for reinvigorating the International Quartet to resume negotiations. Thank you, Excellencies.
I thank my dear colleague Odaiba Eldan Darawi for speaking on behalf of Egypt. And now I am going to go to the questions which have been raised by the wider audience. And I will just read the questions which have been asked. And we have two questions, one coming from Mohammed Imran Idrisi. And the question is, why is it called forced demographic change and not illegal occupation? What is the meaning of forced demographic change under international law? This is one question. There is another question asked by Gabriel Anteus from T.T. Williams School of Law from the University of Richmond. And that question is directed to Mrs. Schaeffer Omer-Man. And the question is, how do you incorporate international law principle of uti possidetis juris and the violation of the principle by Jordan in 1948 into the framework of this issue? Let me repeat it. How do you incorporate international law principle of uti possidetis juris and the violation of the principle by Jordan in 1948 into the framework of this issue? At this point, I would like to thank our colleagues from member states and also those coming from the wider audience to ask these two questions. We wish we had more time, but we are going to try to finish this meeting in the timeline we had. I would like to thank for the very insightful questions and interventions. I would like now to give the floor to our panelists to respond to questions that have been posed, to make comments if so, if they wish, and finally to offer their concluding remarks. And I will start with Mrs. Lara Friedman. You have the floor.
Thank you. I don't really have anything to add. I think the other panelists covered pretty much all of the various aspects of this issue in really excellent detail. I think I'll just use this moment to once again exhort people who are listening to this and watching this to understand that when this issue shows up in the news cycle, it is not new, it is not isolated. This is a systematic policy that has been going on since '67, and it is a policy that depends on people being willing to ignore it, and it depends on impunity. And if there is any hope of shifting this, talking about two states, talking about hope, that's awesome. It's like thoughts and prayers after a mass shooting. It isn't actually going to change anything. And until people are ready to stand up and change something, then again, it is delusional to expect anything but more of the same to continue.
I thank you very much, Mrs. Friedman. Sorry for the interruption, because while you were speaking, I got a phone call because I was told that there are 2 member states who also requested to have the floor. If ever you want to make comments after they speak, you can take it. But let me come back to the member states and give the floor to Turkey. Turkey, you have the floor. Please unmute.
Thank you, Ambassador. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes.
Thank you very much. We welcome this very timely meeting. And of course, thanks to you, to the committee and OIC for bringing our attention, international community's attention to worrying developments in Jerusalem. As we have heard this morning, the ceasefire of May 21 is at risk. And unless the root causes are addressed, the next round of violence is only a matter of time, and we are extremely concerned by this. Israel's illegal actions in Jerusalem, especially aimed at altering the demography and status of the holy city, are at the heart of the conflict, and they continue to be unabated. And despite the fragility of the ceasefire, Israel is still fanning the flames of flashpoints in Jerusalem even today. And we're gravely concerned with demolition activities underway in Silwan, and about the fact that families in Sheikh Jarrah continue to face the threat of eviction. And we heard firsthand accounts of this today. And it appears that the new government has not drawn any lesson from the latest escalation in May, and we are appalled by the latest approval of expansion of illegal settlements in West Bank, as well as, of course, the continuation of efforts to erode the status of Haram al-Sharif. I just wanted to add my voice to those who also underlined that a new crisis is brewing before the world's very eyes, and we cannot continue business as usual. As the UN member states, it's incumbent on all of us. It's time for the international community to take decisive action. In this regard, perhaps to mention briefly the Human Rights Council resolution adopted at the end of May, establishing the ongoing commission of inquiry as an important step. This is, of course, to investigate in the occupied Palestinian territories and Israel all violation of humanitarian law and human rights law, of course, leading up to and since 13th of April. The Commission of Inquiry will also investigate all underlying root causes of the recurrent tensions, instability and repression based on national, ethnic, racial and religious identity. Perhaps if our panelists could dwell upon the future work of this body, which could also play an important role in documenting commission of serious crimes, providing input to the judicial proceedings, and galvanize diplomatic, economic, political measures to uphold the rights of Palestinian people. So it's time to employ all possible avenues to pursue accountability for crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territory. And just wanted to underline that and ask our panelists their views. Thank you very much.
I thank my dear colleague of Turkey. Now I give the floor to Pakistan. Unmute, please. Okay, I'm going to give the floor to Sri Lanka, and then I will come back to Pakistan. Sri Lanka, you have the floor, please. Unmute. So no reaction from Pakistan and Sri Lanka at this point. So I'm now going to revert to our panelists. And I know that I already gave the floor to Mrs. Friedman. I don't know whether she wants to add something after the intervention. No, thank you. So I'm going now to go to Mrs. Emily Schaeffer Omer-Man for her remarks, and then her concluding remarks, and also answering the questions that have been posed by those who spoke. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to briefly address the two questions. I know that there are a lot of us who would like to weigh in, and I also would love to hear Professor Lynk's take on some of the questions that have also been asked that do touch on international law. What I would say to the question about why forced demographic change as opposed to illegal occupation, essentially that we don't have to make that choice. That forced demographic change is an excellent framework for us alongside, and I'll mention what I mean by alongside illegal occupation or violations of occupation in a minute. Forced demographic change is we can think of really as sort of the underlying conduct or characteristic of several grave violations of international humanitarian law, human rights law, and in fact, war crimes and crimes against humanity. So for instance, when we think about what allows that forced demographic change to happen, of course, there is the unlawful deportation or transfer of protected persons, which can be a war crime, a grave breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention, as well as a crime against humanity under each, depending on the circumstances. Of course, there is also property destruction, pillage of land and resources that can contribute to this demographic change, and the transfer in, if you will, of the population of the occupying power, in this case Israel, into the territory that it occupies, East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Generally speaking, I'll just say quickly, with respect to what constitutes an illegal occupation, there's some debate about this. Usually it's scholarly debate, and the debate tends to focus on how the occupation was created rather than how it is carried out. And I think that while there is some merit to looking at whether or not an occupation was the result of a war or of a use of force that was in self-defense or that was aggressive, that was the crime of aggression, if you will, I think rather than looking at that beginning point, there's a lot more value in looking at the violations that are ongoing, especially because they have grown exponentially, right, over the course of the 54 years of occupation. And in my mind, and I think in many other lawyers and scholars' minds, as well as other advocates, what makes this occupation in its essence illegal, even if we're departing from that scholarly framework, is the fact that it fundamentally violates the principles and rules of an occupation, of it being temporary, of there being no change to territory, to property, to laws in place, et cetera, which hark back to early bodies of international humanitarian law. So that's quickly on that. And secondly, there was a question from a university about uti possidetis iuris, and with regard to Jordan, I believe, so pardon me if this is not the way that you had posed the question, or if this is not what you were getting at, but I believe that you may be talking about the status of Jordan and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, in 48 and of course in 1967 when it was occupied by Israel, and whether the fact that Jordan at the time was occupying the territory and had declared sovereignty over it, which was not recognized by the international community, alters the status or alters the legal definition of those territories. And I think I'll just be very brief and say that this is an argument that I sometimes contend with. The general thinking for a while now, and including in this body in the United Nations, is that there is a sovereignty, a future sovereignty held by the Palestinian people, that the territory is occupied because it was not the sovereign territory of Israel beforehand, and that the status and the fact that there was not a Palestinian state in that land beforehand does not change the fact that this is an occupation. The occupation law applies, which, as a side note, even the Israeli Supreme Court acknowledges, and therefore that this is the framework that we need to be viewing this conflict from. Thank you very much.
I thank very much Mrs. Schaeffer Omer-Man for responding to the question, particularly to the question posed by the university. I know that many of my colleagues from member states want to take the floor. I'm just going to allow maybe one of them, Tunisia, she's insisting, to take the floor, and then I will come back to the panel. Tunisia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the committee and the OIC for organizing this international conference on the question of Jerusalem. This is indeed a timely and very important event, given the sensitivity of the issue and the scale of the Israeli violations of the UN resolutions and international law in the occupied Palestinian territory. We also thank the briefers for their valuable remarks. As stated in previous UN resolutions, all legislative and administrative measures and actions taken by the occupying power, which purport to alter the character and status of the holy city of Jerusalem, have no legal validity and constitute a flagrant violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and also constitute a serious obstruction to achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East. We also join our voice to other speakers to note that with great concern that the looming evictions of dozens of Palestinian families from their homes in occupied East Jerusalem, particularly in the Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan neighborhoods of the city, are still exacerbating tensions in the occupied Palestinian territory. The attempts to dispossess and displace the families living in these localities for decades and replace them with Israeli settlers are unacceptable by all standards and are contrary to the international law. These hostile behavior and heinous measures and acts should stop immediately. We firmly reject any attempts to alter the historical and legal status quo in Jerusalem. The international community should put maximum pressure to ensure full respect by the occupying power of the status quo in the city and put an end to impunity. We also highlight the importance of the historical Hashemite custodianship over these holy sites in Jerusalem. As a permanent member of the Security Council, Tunisia will keep the attention and the focus on the matter within the Council, and will spare no efforts at all levels in support of the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including the right to national independence and sovereignty. In closing, we believe that reversing the current trends needs much more attention from the international community, including through the intensification and acceleration of efforts to launch credible negotiations on all final status issues in the Middle East peace process. An enhanced quartet involvement in this regard is of paramount importance. I thank you, Mr. President.
Yeah, I thank you very much, my dear colleague Nasreddin, for the statement made on behalf of Tunisia. And I'm going now to come back to the last segment of our event with Mrs. Suma Qawasmi. You have the floor for your answers to the questions, comments, and your concluding remarks. You have the floor. Mrs. Qawasmi, if you are there, maybe you should unmute. Okay, we lost Mrs. Qawasmi. I will try her again. I'm going now to give the floor to Mrs. Sandouka. Mrs. Sandouka, you have the floor.
Thank you very much again for this opportunity and for all the speakers. I think I will conclude by highlighting a very important issue that is going on in Jerusalem and more widely with the Palestinian youth. It is a fact that my generation, the generation that was born in the 80s and previously witnessed the first Intifada, lived through the second Intifada, witnessed settlement expansion, Oslo. And Oslo for us was a moment of hope. And it gave us a belief that we can live side by side as two states. But the younger generation right now, they never witnessed Oslo. On the contrary, they see the two-state solution is not something that can be attainable. And right now, their fight is over equal rights. So right now, if we don't actually take action, then the two-state solution is dead. For the to give hope for the younger generation, we need to step up our efforts right now for a peace process that includes youth voice as well as women voice in the process. And thank you so much for following up.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Sandouka. Let me try again Mrs. Qawasmi to see if she's still there. Mrs. Qawasmi?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, please take the floor.
I'll just say thank you so much for inviting me again to speak about what's going on in my neighborhood. We really believe that after this movement and everything that's going on, and now we believe that our case now is supposed to be a global case, as from the beginning we took the houses as an agreement between the UNRWA and the government, the Jordanian government. So we really believe that this case is supposed to be between governments. It's supposed to be between the UNRWA and the Jordanian government and the Israeli government, not to keep all of the pressure on us as individuals. And that's what also one thing that we're asking for is to take the case out of the Israeli courts and to take it to the Criminal and Justice Court. Thank you so much again for giving me the platform to speak. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. I believe there's no time, unfortunately. Thank you so much.
I thank you very much, Mrs. Qawasmi. And now, last but not least, I'm going to give the floor to our friend, Mr. Michael Lynk. Mr. Lynk, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nyang. My closing point is very simple. Accountability is the only way forward. Israel has never paid a meaningful price for its forever occupation, and has become much bolder since the international community blinked in 1980 after resolutions 476 and 478, when it didn't carry through with its promise to impose practical means and ways. Please keep in mind that Israel is a rational actor, and if it knows that there's going to be impunity for its actions, then it is magical thinking to believe that criticism without consequences is going to lead anywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Special Rapporteur, Professor Michael Lynk. I would like to thank our 5 speakers, Mrs. Friedman, Mr. Lynk, Mrs. Qawasmi, Mrs. Sandouka, Mrs. Schaeffer Omer-Man, for taking the time to participate in the panel and in responding to the questions which have been posed. Today's discussion yielded a very fruitful conversation and stimulated a number of recommendations that the committee will take into account. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, this concludes today's event. I would like to thank all the members and observers of the committee, the wider UN membership, our partners in the civil society, and the public at large for attending. Special thanks from the committee to our dear friend, Assistant Secretary General Bakr, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation for the long-standing and continuing partnership and support. I would also like to reiterate the gratitude of the committee to the UN Under Secretary General DiCarlo for her attendance and remarks. The committee also thanks the Division for Palestinian Rights of United Nations Secretariat for organizing this event, for the very efficient support the committee is benefiting from it. I would like to remind everyone that a recording of this event will be shortly uploaded on the webpage of the committee at www.un.org/UNISPA, where you will be able to learn more about the question of Palestine, the work of the committee, and about other upcoming events on our YouTube page. I hereby declare closed the 2021 International Conference on the Question of Jerusalem under the theme Fourth Demographic Change in Jerusalem, Great Riches and a Threat to Peace. I thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Merci. Thank you.
Merci infiniment.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much.
شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا.
Hello.